Good afternoon. It's really nice to be here and be with you. The topic I'm going to be talking about today is something I've been working on for a long, long time. So, sustained attention or vigilance refers to the ability of operators to maintain their focus of attention and to detect target stimuli over prolonged periods of time. This ability is a crucial component of work environments where automated human-machine systems are involved, such as military surveillance, aviation, sea and rail transportation, industrial process and quality control, medical monitoring and screening, and airport, border, and cyber security. In other words, vigilance plays a large role in many of our daily activities. At first glance, the task of acting as a system monitor who observes instrument displays and takes action only when problems arise would seem to be a modest work assignment, and consequently, a blessing of automation. However, research has shown that the need to remain vigilant reflects two basic elements in human engineering. First, the human operator is often the weakest link in the human-machine system. Accidents ranging from minor to major have resulted from vigilance failures on the part of human operators. And second, what initially appears to be a simple problem, looking at a display and waiting for a negative event to occur, is really very complex. Where did it all start from? Well, the systematic study of vigilance is generally considered to have begun during World War II. German submarines were causing havoc in British shipping with great loss of life and supplies. Finding and sinking the submarines was a key mission for the Royal Navy and the RAF. In that era, submarines needed to surface fairly often to recharge batteries and were vulnerable if they were detected. A first approach to the detection problem was to train pigeons to land on conning towers. And if they landed on a sub that was not in the British registry, the Navy and the RAF could sink the threatening vessel. Pretty crude. Shortly, however, as a much more advanced solution became available in the form of the newly developed pulse position radar displays that many of you can remember from watching movies when you were a kid. The new technology was not troubled by clouds or weather, not misled by waves or camouflage, and it enabled airborne RAF observers to spot enemy submarines from miles away and to swoop in and destroy them before they could take evasive action. Problem solved? Not quite. After only about 30 minutes on watch, the well-trained and highly motivated airborne observers began to miss the blips on their radar screens, and the undetected U-boats were free to sink allied ships. The RAF commissioned Dr. Norman Mackworth to study this unexpected dilemma. Toward that end, he created a simulated radar display called the clock test. As you can see in the slide, it consisted of a blank-faced clock in which a pointer rotated around the face in 0.3-inch jumps. Occasionally, the pointer would make a double jump of 0.6 inches, and this was the critical signal that the observer was to detect by pressing a button. Using the clock test, Dr. Mackworth confirmed in the laboratory the field-generated suspicion that the quality of sustained attention is fragile, waning quickly over time. He found that the frequency of missed signals, and so on the graph here, the ordinate is the number of signals missed. He found that the frequency of missed signals increased from 15% to 25% within the first 10 minutes on task and continued to increase more gradually for the remainder of the 2-hour vigil. This drop in performance over time is known as the Vigilance Decrement, or the decrement function. It's been replicated in the many hundreds of studies that have followed Dr. Mackworth's pioneering work and is the most ubiquitous finding in vigilance research. The decrement is illustrated schematically in the next slide, which shows the temporal decline in detections to be accompanied by an increment in response time to correct detections. So you miss the targets, and when you detect them much more slowly. Studies have now shown that most of the decrement typically appears within the first 15 minutes of watch. But when task demands are high, it can appear as rapidly as in the first 5 minutes, a finding that we have discovered. The vigilance decrement has been found with experienced as well as with inexperienced observers, and it appears in operational environments as well as in laboratory settings. It's a general characteristic of human observers in tasks requiring sustained attention. In addition to an inability to sustain performance efficiency over time, human operators in assignments requiring sustained attention are faced with a number of serious perceptual challenges. Time doesn't permit me to describe them all, but I shall describe a few. A common finding in studies of target detection under alerted conditions is that the frequency of detections is positively related to stimulus amplitude and duration. And this is also true in the case of sustained attention. As shown in the next slide, increasing the amplitude and duration of signals enhances vigilance performance. So in this graph, what we're looking at is an auditory graph. Here is the intensity of the signal. This is the number of missed targets, and you can see that when the signal intensity is strong, misses are low, and when it's weak, misses are high. And this graph shows how detection efficiency increases as signal duration increases. Unfortunately, low amplitude and brief duration stimuli are frequently encountered in the operational environment. Like lookouts in old-time sailing vessels, operators in sustained attention tasks are confronted with a considerable temporal and spatial uncertainty about the signals that they are to detect. They may not know when they will appear or where they will appear. And these forms of uncertainty have powerful effects on vigilance performance. One means of manipulating the observer's temporal uncertainty is through variation in the number of signals presented in a vigilance session. The more frequently signals occur in a fixed period of time, the greater their probability and the lower the observer's uncertainty about when they will appear. As shown in the next slide, the accuracy of signal detection increases as a function of signal density or probability. Spatial uncertainty has been introduced into vigilance experiments by varying the probability that signals will appear in different locations in a monitored display. And performance efficiency is lowered under such conditions. An example of spatial uncertainty comes from a recent study in our lab which simulated an air traffic control task, in which operators were required to monitor a flight of UAVs and detect when one of the flight members was flying in an inappropriate direction. In the spatial uncertainty condition, the image of the flight could appear in only the center of the observer's display. In an uncertain condition, the flight image could appear at random in 5 areas of the display. And as you can see in the slide that's on the screen right now, spatial uncertainty greatly degraded performance efficiency. Signal detections were much greater in the certain than in the uncertain case. It's important to note that in the operational world, signal probability is low, and stimulus events for detection are not limited to a single predictable display location. The bad guys don't always come from the same place. In many operational settings requiring sustained attention, critical signals for detection are embedded in a matrix of recurrent background events. For example, in airport security, a baggage-held weapon may appear in a background of many weaponless bags. To study this issue, investigators have asked observers to detect targets appearing in a cascade of neutral non-target events. For example, detecting occasional longer excursions in the movement of a band of light in a background of short excursions. The results show that although the background events are neutral in that they require no response from the observer, they are far from neutral in their influence on the quality of sustained attention. As shown in the next figure, based on studies from our laboratory, increasing background event rate, going, let's say, from 6 to 21 events a minute, performance is degraded, and the background event rate increase amplifies the negative effect of low signal amplitude. Okay, and let's see if we can try to save a little time. To also look at the event rate effect, we varied not only the background event rate, but also whether the background events occur in a predictable manner, like 1 every second or 1 every 2 seconds, or in an unpredictable manner. And what the slide here shows is that the background event rate can basically be worse off when the signals occur in an asynchronous than in a synchronous manner. So if we look at it this way, what we're seeing is that a lot of what happens in a vigilance experiment, a lot of what determines how well you do, is based on what goes on when there are no signals on the display, what goes on in the background in which the signals appear. Along with the effects just described, vigilance performance is also degraded by increasing the number of displays to be monitored. Exemplified in a study in which the observers were asked to look at several Mackworth clock displays at one time, the more displays they had to monitor, the worse, of course, they did. Now, in addition to confronting operators with serious perceptual challenges, sustained attention tasks induce high levels of workload and stress in those that perform them. Studies of the cognitive demand of vigilance tasks have utilized the NASA Task Load Index, which is considered to be one of the most effective measures of perceived mental workload currently available. It provides a measure of overall or global workload on a scale of 0 to 100 and identifies the relative contributions of 6 sources of workload: mental demand, temporal demand, physical demand, performance, effort, and frustration. And my colleagues and I were the ones that introduced the workload measurement to the study of vigilance. And what you can see in the next slide is that the workload of vigilance is high. The ratings fall at the upper end of the TLX scale, and workload increases as time on task progresses. So the longer you stay at the task, the harder it seems to do the job. And in addition, in terms of the dimensions of workload that are triggered by vigilance performance, mental demand and frustration are the major elements. So I'm doing a task, I'm not doing very well, I'm working very hard, I have high mental demand and high frustration. Not a very pleasant thing to be in. And therefore, consistent with the view that coping with a high task load comes with a physiological and psychological cost, the elevated levels of mental workload in vigilance are accompanied by elevated levels of stress as revealed through physiological and both self-report measures. In terms of physiology, catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine levels in the circulating bloodstream are often considered as indices of stress, and these levels are elevated in the performance of vigilance tasks. In addition, electromyographic techniques have shown increased muscle tremor and restlessness as time on task progresses, and our studies have shown that vigilance tasks can induce muscle tension headaches in sensitive observers. On a self-report level, operators describe themselves as feeling significantly less attentive and more bored, strained, irritated, fatigued, and sleepy after a vigil and prior to its start. My colleagues and I have used the Dundee Stress State Questionnaire to assess the ways in which stress associated with vigilance tasks can be experienced as disturbances in motivation, affect, and cognition through measures of task engagement, distress, and worry. Task engagement contrasts enthusiasm and interest with fatigue and apathy. Distress encompasses negative moods and lack of confidence, and worry reflects negative self-referent cognitions. The slide that's on the screen now shows the results of several of our studies, which have demonstrated that participation in a vigilance task typically leads to a loss of task engagement accompanied by feelings of distress, and that these changes increase with increments in task difficulty. So you have an assignment of watching for whatever you're supposed to watch for. You wind up with high workload, headaches, high levels of distress, and increased levels of task disengagement. Not a very pleasant situation. And the stress induced by vigilance tasks has important operational concerns because stress plays a role in reducing operator productivity and safety and health. In order to understand the nature of sustained attention more fully, investigators have sought to map the brain regions involved in vigilance performance. A considerable number of neuroimaging studies using positron emission tomography, PET, and functional magnetic imaging, fMRI, have found that the sustained attention task is mediated by multiple neural networks encompassing cortical and subcortical levels. Included are the anterior cingulate cortex, the middle and inferior prefrontal cortex, regions in the parietal lobe, the basal ganglia, the interlaminary region of the thalamus, and the reticular formation. What appeared to be a very simple task is not so simple in terms of the brain areas involved. Our lab has used a neuroimaging method known as Transcranial Doppler sonography, or TCD, to assess the cerebral hemodynamics during the performance of vigilance tasks. This method uses ultrasound signals to examine cerebral blood flow velocity, or CBFV, during vigilance task performance. Primarily in the middle cerebral, let's go back one. Primarily in the middle cerebral artery within each cerebral hemisphere. And that cerebral artery carries about 80% of the blood within each hemisphere. The logic behind the use of this procedure is that in the performance of mental tasks, byproducts of this activity, such as carbon dioxide, increase. And that leads to increased blood flow to the region to remove the unwanted byproduct. Thus, the greater the mental activity, the greater the cerebral blood flow velocity. As illustrated in the next slide, what we find is that the vigilance decrement is accompanied by a decline in cerebral blood flow velocity, but the decline is task-specific. It only occurs when the observers view a display with a working imperative. It does not occur when they sit there and view the display for the same period of time, but without a work imperative. In addition, we found that when observers detect the target, there is a blip in blood flow. And that blip does not occur when they miss the signal or when neutral events are occurring that don't require detection. And the size of the blip decreases over time. So what we apparently are finding is that the vigilance decrement is accompanied by a shutdown in neural activity. As I noted earlier, requiring sustained attention would on the surface seem to pose a simple problem in which operators only need to look or listen for the presence of critical stimulus events. In reality, however, we see that the maintenance of sustained attention is a complex problem involving a montage of perceptual demands, high levels of workload and stress, and multidimensional neural systems, which shut down as task performance progresses. Clearly, operator vigilance is a key component of automated human-machine systems and a critical human factors problem. This problem will increase in importance in the years ahead, given the extensive growth in the contribution of automation to all realms of human work. One might wonder why this problem exists in the first place. After all, given the perennial contest between predator and prey, the need for vigilance has likely been a vital part of the human condition as long as our species has been around. If we weren't very vigilant many, many hundreds of years ago, we wouldn't be here today. Why is it such a problem in monitoring displays? In a major article published last year in the American Psychologist, my colleague, Dr. Peter Hancock, who was a former president of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society, has advanced two answers to that question. He points out that the designers of systems that emphasize automation tend to focus predominantly on the computer-based automation itself and not on the role of the human operator. As a result, the displays to be monitored are often poorly designed for human use. On a broader level, Dr. Hancock points out that in the natural world, sustaining attention is intrinsically motivated, and observers have control over the nature of the inspection process and what is being observed. In contrast, human operators in automated systems must contend with the extrinsically imposed need to constrain the normally free-roving, self-directed information acquiring capacity of attention. In this sense, they are placed in a cognitively unfamiliar, stressful, and disadvantaged role. In essence, the development of automated technology has not placed a proper interest in the role that the human observer must play. And therefore, there are a lot of problems. Thank you.